A canine materialized from the mist that morning, drenched, faltering, and tenuously alive. Yet he was not unaccompanied. Within his jaws, he bore a moribund puppy, its minuscule form inert, its vitality rapidly diminishing. They had traversed a frigid river, leaving behind an obscure and unspoken horror. Devoid of collar or name, only scars marked their passage. Nevertheless, they persisted until they arrived at a solitary stranger's threshold in the snow-laden wilderness of Montana. The ensuing events will linger in your memory long after this narrative concludes, because at times, when the world averts its gaze, the connection between two souls becomes the sole force potent enough to endure. The morning was severe. Montana's untamed expanse poses no inquiries. It simply exists, harsh, immense, and silent. The river had been frozen for days, but on this day, the ice yielded with groans as piercing as shattered glass. Winds shrieked like far-off alarms. Amidst the haze of snow and profound cold, something stirred. Not a mere object, but a being. A German shepherd. His coat, laden with frost, trailed behind him like a shroud of agony. His respiration was shallow, visible in brief exhalations. And he was not solitary. Held firmly in his mouth was a puppy, barely animate, limp, more a shadow than a living creature. The shepherd lurched onward, not merely limping, but collapsing between strides. One leg, severely injured, gave way with each movement. He proceeded now by sheer instinct, a raw determination etched into his muscles. Every few feet, he paused, his head drooping as if gravity exerted a stronger pull on his broken form. Ahead lay the river, not a placid current, but a tumultuous, ice-choked torrent that appeared to have consumed the last soul that ventured near. Yet the dog showed no hesitation. Retreat was not an option. Behind him, the wilderness stretched empty, frigid, and something more ominous than the weather pursued them. He entered the flow. The initial wave struck him like a blow. He faltered, nearly losing his grip on the pup, but he pressed on, paws slipping, lungs laboring. His body jerked as if electrified, but he tightened his hold on the tiny pup and pushed through. For a moment, it seemed the current would prevail, but then it did not. He resurfaced, coughing, struggling, his head above water, legs paddling with more effort than they seemingly possessed. Minutes, or perhaps hours, later he reached the opposite bank. His strength failed him. He collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, his chest barely rising. The puppy emitted a soft whimper. That sound, as faint as wind through pine needles, was sufficient to propel him forward once more. Now crawling, he dragged himself, inch by inch, towards the tree-line, and then a scent. Smoke, distant but tangible. Somewhere ahead, beyond the white obscurity and skeletal trees, lay shelter. Not warmth, not safety, merely a possibility. He moved again, snow pressing into his wounds like daggers, branches scraping his underbelly. His breath turned into small coughs, but his eyes remained fixed on the smoke. He was no longer fleeing. He was delivering the one remaining thing in his world. Not himself, but the puppy. And as he dragged himself onward, foot by bloodied foot, the forest behind him grew quiet again, excessively so. For while nature can be unsparing, silence is something else entirely. Silence implies something is observing, something is waiting. Still, he persisted. Ahead stood a single cabin, nestled in the woods like a hidden treasure, smoke ascending from its chimney. And for the first time, perhaps ever, he was no longer running from something, he was running towards someone. Nolan Avery had no intention of participating in anyone's rescue narrative. Ensconced in the depths of the Montana woods, his cabin served more as a bastion than a dwelling. A sanctuary he had constructed meticulously, timber by timber, fastener by fastener, after abandoning a world that demanded too much and offered too little. The forest was now his confidant, the snow merely another indication that life does not pause for sorrow. He navigated his mornings with a practiced routine. Black coffee, splitting firewood, mending the shed, and so on. This particular morning, however, was different. He sipped his beverage by the frost-covered window, observing snowflakes eddying like embers from a dwindling fire. And then he saw it, a fleeting movement beyond the tree-line. Not the graceful stride of a deer, nor the wary amble of a fox. No, this was a limping, dragging motion. Nolan's eyes narrowed, his instincts alerted. He set down his cup, reached for his coat, and stepped out into the frigid air. The wind struck forcefully, penetrating his layers. He crunched through the snow, his boots heavy, his breath visible in plumes. 20 yards out, he halted. A dark, motionless shape lay just beyond the birch trees, with another, smaller form pressed against it. For an instant, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Nolan's heart began to beat with a rhythm he hadn't experienced in years. He covered the remaining distance more rapidly now, his knees cracking with the effort, and then he saw it. The German shepherd collapsed face down in the snow. Ice clung to his eyelashes. His sides rose only faintly with each slow, shallow breath. Beside him, curled against his chest, was a tiny pup, too small, too still. Nolan dropped to his knees. No, 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 he muttered, already removing his gloves, searching for any indication of life. His fingers located the pup's side, a heartbeat, weak and thready, but present. Then he touched the shepherd's chest, another pulse, slower, barely perceptible. No collar, no tags, just raw fur. Blood had crusted near one leg and a tremor ran through his frame. He had no idea of their origin, but whatever it was, they hadn't arrived here by chance, they were escaping something. That much he sensed intuitively. He scooped up the puppy first, wrapping it inside his coat, then lifted the shepherd in both arms, gritting his teeth as the weight pressed down. He was heavier than anticipated, all muscle and frozen, waterlogged fur. But Nolan carried him step by arduous step back to the cabin. Inside, he kicked the door shut and laid them gently by the wood stove. The heat intensified. The cabin, once a haven for one man's solitude, now housed a silent emergency. Nolan moved swiftly, blankets, dry towels, anything soft and warm. He added another log to the fire, then another. He hadn't built this fire to save lives, but now it was imperative. He didn't even register that his hands were trembling as he rubbed the shepherd's chest. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, big fella. Don't give up." The shepherd offered no response, not even a flicker. But then the puppy stirred, a cough, a soft cry. It broke something within Nolan, a fissure in his defenses. He looked down and saw the dog's paw twitch. A breath rattled from him. Still present, fading, but still present. And just like that, everything altered. Nolan had spent years constructing a life where no one could inflict pain upon him again. But lying on his floor now were two strangers who had endured something he didn't comprehend, and he found himself unable to turn away. The cold outside no longer instilled fear in him. What frightened him now was the intensity of his desire for them to survive. Within the cabin, the silence was now oppressive, not tranquil, but charged with tension, the kind of stillness that feels like holding one's breath submerged, uncertain of resurfacing. Nolan knelt beside the German shepherd, whose eyes remained closed, his respiration uneven and shallow, like a fraying thread. Nearby, the puppy emitted the faintest whimper, a sound so delicate it could have been mistaken for the settling of wood in the stove. Yet Nolan heard it, and it affected him profoundly, shifting and sharpening the weight in his chest. He retrieved an old pile of towels and commenced drying the shepherd's fur, his hands moving with a combination of solicitude and urgency. The fur was matted in places with frozen blood, and it required effort not to grimace at each wound he uncovered. A long laceration ran along the dog's flank, clean, deliberate, as if inflicted by something not of the wild. His leg, swollen and rigid, bore a deep puncture wound that carried a faint odor of infection. Nolan had encountered injuries before, hunting mishaps, vehicular impacts, but this was no accident. Someone had done this. The puppy shivered violently, curled into a small ball of breath and ribs. Nolan reached for an old crate by the fireplace, lined it with fleece, placed the pup gently inside, draped a warm flannel shirt over him, and set a small bowl of warm water nearby. The pup was too feeble to move, but his tiny eyes fluttered open for a mere fraction of a second. "That's sufficient," Nolan whispered. "Hold on, little one." He returned his attention to the shepherd and began rubbing his chest, encouraging respiration, maintaining circulation. The dog groaned, a sound so guttural it caused Nolan to freeze. Then, without opening his eyes, the dog coughed, a wet, sharp sound. Relief surged through Nolan. He wasn't gone. Not yet. Nolan moved swiftly, pulling down an old first aid box from a shelf. It had remained untouched for years, filled with partially used ointments and forgotten gauze. He applied a thin layer of antiseptic to the wounds, cleaned the dog's face, and wrapped the injured leg tightly. Then he proceeded to the kitchen, boiled sugar water, and used a spoon to drip small amounts between the shepherd's lips. It was not veterinary care, but it was all he had, and at that moment it was everything. Hours passed like days. Nolan remained by their side, stoking the fire when the room grew cold, replenishing the water, and murmuring nonsense merely to keep his voice present in the air, anything to dispel the silence. Outside, the storm intensified once more. The wind howled. Snow battered the windows. But within the cabin, something was thawing, and it wasn't just ice. At some point, Nolan sat back in his chair, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. He looked at the shepherd again and found the dog staring directly at him, not wide-eyed, just observing, assessing. There was no bark, no growl, just the kind of gaze that felt as though it pierced deeper than words ever could. The shepherd did not know Nolan, but in that moment, an understanding existed between them, two beings, both broken in different ways, finally perceiving something familiar in the other. The dog shifted slightly, nudging closer to the crate where the puppy rested, protective even while semi-conscious. Nolan felt that ache again, the same one from the woods, the one he thought he had buried years ago with every mile of distance he established between himself and the world. "You brought him all this way," Nolan said under his breath, "carried him through that hell." No reply, just the soft hiss of wind outside. But Nolan knew he wasn't imagining it. That look in the shepherd's eyes, it wasn't just survival, it was something far more haunting. It was purpose. Morning arrived with a silence so profound it resonated more loudly than any tempest. Nolan stepped outdoors, exhaling into the biting cold air, his boots compacting the fresh snow. The trees stood frozen, rigid as if centuries had been guarding the world's edge. The wind had subsided, yet something felt amiss, overly staged, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He stooped near the woodpile and immediately noticed it. Tracks. Not diminutive, not innocuous, large, deep, widely spaced, and not the kind left by a moose or a bear. These impressions bore claw marks at their tips, too deliberate to be from wandering wildlife. They were recent, hours old. His stomach tightened as he followed them a short distance along the tree line. They circled, not merely passing through. This was a perimeter inspection. Someone or something had approached the cabin, close enough to peer inside. Nolan turned back towards the door, his heart now racing. And then he heard it. One bark, low, from inside. A single, sharp warning, not frantic, not fearful, but precise, alert. He rushed back in, slamming the door behind him, and saw the German shepherd standing unsteadily by the front window, his body trembling from the exertion, but his eyes fixed like a scope on the trees. There was no mistaking it. Whatever had been out there, the dog knew. And he wasn't just recuperating now, he was guarding. Nolan knelt beside him. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he muttered. The dog didn't look at him. Just stood there, breathing heavily, front legs stiff, head tilted forward like a soldier refusing to abandon his post. The puppy stirred in the crate, emitting a soft cry, and only then did the dog finally turn. His body moving back to the crate as if drawn by an invisible force, as if protection wasn't merely instinct, but a mission. This wasn't just a successful rescue. It was the midpoint of something not yet concluded. That realization settled into Nolan like frigid water. He double-locked the doors, slid the thick bar across the front, and retrieved the shotgun he hadn't touched in years. It was dusty, a little stiff but functional. He placed it near the fireplace, his eyes constantly shifting between the dog, the pup, and the windows. For a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, he was now deeply entangled in something he couldn't begin to articulate. Later that afternoon, as the wind rose again, Nolan endeavored to calm the atmosphere within the cabin. He laid more towels near the fire, prepared a simple stew, and poured warm broth into a saucer. The puppy finally drank, slowly but steadily, its small body still twitching from the trauma. Nolan couldn't stop observing the shepherd. How he refused to sleep, how he winced with every step but remained close to the pup as if tethered. And then there was that scar. Nolan noticed it clearly now beneath the matted fur on the shepherd's neck. A dark, raised welt that wrapped partially around the side of his throat. Not from a fight, not from barbed wire. This was straight-edged, mechanical, as if a collar had once been clamped too tightly, for too long, possibly burned in. "Who did this to you?" Nolan whispered. The dog didn't flinch, just lowered his head beside the crate and exhaled as if to say, that part didn't matter anymore. But Nolan knew better. Such things don't disappear. They remain, they shape. And whatever pain this dog had endured, it hadn't crushed him. It had transformed him into something relentless. Night fell again. Nolan sat near the window, rifle by his leg, eyes scanning the tree-line through the cracked blinds. The shepherd finally rested, though even in sleep, one ear remained cocked towards the door. The puppy breathed quietly, curled tight like a leaf in winter. Outside, the wind carried something unfamiliar. Not just snow, but tension, as if whatever had come before might return. And this time they wouldn't be running. By the subsequent morning, the storm outside had abated into a consistent hush, but within the cabin, tension condensed like smoke. Nolan had slept little. His eyes were lined, his hands gripping the coffee mug that had long since cooled. The German shepherd rested beside the crate, his body curled protectively around the puppy. Yet Nolan observed the twitch of his ears at every creak, every gust of wind, every shift of snow on the roof. His senses were heightened, his body recuperating, but his mind, like that of a soldier, remained acutely alert. The puppy had shown slight improvement. It still lacked the strength to stand for extended periods, but its eyes now remained open more frequently, blinking up at the shepherd's face with each movement. And the dog, he did not truly sleep, merely dozed in brief intervals, like a sentinel on double duty in an unseen war zone. Nolan observed all of this from the edge of the fireplace, his jaw set, his thoughts racing. He was no stranger to survival. He had built this life from loss and necessity. But this situation was different. These were not strays wandering through. They arrived with a purpose, with wounds that spoke not merely of nature's harshness, but of human cruelty. The tracks, the scars, the shepherd's unblinking endurance even in pain. It all pointed to a single conclusion Nolan was reluctant to voice. Someone had harmed them, and that someone might now be searching for them. He rose, paced towards the front window, and looked out. The forest stared back in quiet defiance. And then, just as he turned to replenish the fire, a low growl rumbled from the shepherd's chest. Nolan froze. The dog had sat up, ears forward, eyes locked on the same window Nolan had just left. No bark, just that deep, steady growl, controlled, intentional. Nolan moved quickly, grabbed the shotgun from the sidewall and peered out. Nothing. Trees. Snow. Quiet. But the dog didn't relax. The growl continued until finally, after a full minute, he exhaled and dropped his head again, though his eyes remained on that window. That afternoon, Nolan chopped firewood with twice his usual energy. The rhythm was a release, each crack of the axe breaking through the heaviness creeping into the edges of his mind. When he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he turned and looked back at the spot where the dog had first collapsed. His breath caught. There was something buried in the snow. He dropped the axe, marched over, and kicked at the mound. A metallic glint caught the light, something shiny and round. He reached down and pulled it free. It was a collar, bent, scorched on one edge, covered in dried blood. The tag was missing, ripped off, maybe filed down. The ring was still attached, but barely hanging. Nolan stared at it for a long time before heading back in. He sat beside the shepherd again, holding the collar in his hand. The dog didn't react to the sight of it, but Nolan swore he saw the faintest flicker in his eyes. Recognition? Not surprise, just confirmation. This was his. "You carried a pup across a river with a leg like that?" Nolan muttered. "And you still don't sleep unless you're sure he's safe." He placed the collar down gently on the table beside the crate. It didn't belong around that neck anymore. It belonged in the past. A warning, a marker. Whatever had once been done to this dog, whoever had tried to own or break him, had failed. Outside, the snow started again, but this time it was lighter, peaceful. Nolan sat on the floor, leaning against the fireplace, the heat washing over him. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop from the wood and the soft, rhythmic breathing of two beings who refused to give up. And for the first time in years, Nolan didn't feel alone. Not in the cabin, not in the silence, not in the fight that hadn't yet arrived, but was clearly on its way. 3 days elapsed. 3 days of gradual recovery, wary quietness, and eyes that never fully rested. The puppy had finally begun to stand on unsteady legs, albeit only for brief moments at a time. But this progress alone was sufficient to bring a wave of silent jubilation to the cabin. The German shepherd, still limping and bruised, had regained some measure of strength, enough to pace from the crate to the window every few hours, his tail twitching like a sensitive instrument. Nolan observed the alteration. An unspoken communication transpired between the shepherd and the pup, a language devoid of sound. Whenever the puppy whimpered, the dog would be present. Not hurried, not agitated, just there, steadfast, as if he had made an inviolable promise the instant he dragged that small form through the river. On the third morning, Nolan ventured outside with an armful of kindling. The snow had ceased, but the world remained enveloped in a white hush. He moved past the porch to the location where the shepherd had initially collapsed and paused. Something was protruding from the packed ice, barely discernible. He crouched, brushed away the frost, and uncovered a piece of bent metal. It was frigid to the touch, corroded at the edges, and encrusted with something dark and long-dried. He turned it over slowly, his breath catching in his throat. A collar, or what remained of one. The band had been severed or torn cleanly on one side. The tag ring was snapped. The tag itself was entirely missing. And burned into the inner edge, faint yet unmistakable, was a line of crude etching, numbers, perhaps, or initials. Nolan couldn't be certain, but it did not resemble anything intended for reading. It looked more like a mark, a brand. He stood there, holding it in his gloved hand, staring down as if he had just extracted a confession from the earth itself. Inside the cabin, the shepherd was observing, not the window but Nolan. When he re-entered, collar in hand, the shepherd's body tensed slightly, not in fear, but in recollection. Nolan placed the collar on the table slowly, as if it were an artifact too sacred to handle without reverence. The dog did not approach it, did not sniff it, just sat motionless, his gaze fixed upon it like a wound being reopened. Nolan understood now. This was not a typical instance of abandonment or straying. This was an escape from something deliberate, something human. That night, as snow began to fall once more, the atmosphere within the cabin shifted, not becoming darker, but sharper. Every external noise was met with a glance. Every crunch of ice caused the shepherd to stiffen beside the door. Nolan barely consumed any food, his eyes darting between the fire, the dog, and the trees outside. A pressure was building, silent yet undeniable, like a book on the verge of turning a page long marked by fate. Then, just before midnight, the shepherd stirred, ears forward, head tilted. A low, dry growl emanated from his throat. Nolan grabbed the shotgun, his heart ascending into his chest. He moved to the window and slid the curtain aside just an inch. A black truck was parked within the treeline, lights off, engine barely audible. He didn't see the driver, he didn't need to. He backed away from the window and looked at the shepherd, who hadn't moved an inch, just stood like a statue forged in the crucible of survival. Nolan whispered under his breath, "So that's who you were running from." The cabin was no longer merely a refuge. It was a crossroads, a final confrontation awaiting. The broken collar on the table was no longer just a clue. It was a threat, a promise. And Nolan finally perceived it. The complete picture, stitched together in silence and scars. This dog hadn't just escaped something malevolent. He had carried innocence from its grasp. And now that malevolence had found them. Nolan did not rest that night, nor did the shepherd. An exchange of glances was unnecessary. Both comprehended that silence can be deafening, that unmoving headlights are more perilous than a charging bear. The black truck had not departed. It had vanished like smoke dissipating from a snuffed match. By sunrise, the sky was again heavy with gray clouds, but it was no longer snow that Nolan feared. It was what had already arrived and what might follow. He poured stale coffee, disregarded it, then quietly opened a drawer and retrieved an old topographical map. The ranger station lay 5 miles eastward through challenging terrain, but it was attainable if he set out before the snow recommenced. He looked down at the puppy, still curled, its tiny breaths rising and falling, a soft snore like a whimper. The shepherd sat beside him, calm yet never relaxed. Nolan muttered, "I'll be back." The dog blinked once. No bark, just that profound, mutual understanding. The hike was arduous. Nolan had to pause several times to catch his breath, the cold clinging to his lungs like damp fabric. But he succeeded, bursting into the ranger station with snow on his coat, mud caking his legs, and an expression that made the on-duty officer straighten before Nolan even uttered a word. He recounted everything he could about the shepherd, the puppy, the wounds, the black truck, the tracks encircling his property, the scars, the silence. He anticipated incredulity. Instead, the ranger leaned forward and said, "You need to see something." What ensued was a silent perusal of reports. 2 counties over, a dog-fighting operation had been dismantled 3 days prior. The perpetrators had fled. Several dogs were discovered dead. Others had vanished. 2 men, names undisclosed, remained at large. Their vehicle, a matte black Chevy truck, no license plates, engine modified for quiet operation. Nolan's throat went dry. One of the escaped dogs had been a German shepherd. Reports indicated he was aggressive, trained for combat, and unlikely to survive in the wild. But the ranger added something further, something that struck harder than any headline. One of the officers found a crate in the back. Inside was a puppy initially thought to be deceased, but when they lifted it out for burial, it moved barely. Then the shepherd attacked one of the handlers and fled, carrying the pup off into the woods. Nolan sat in stunned silence. The image was now complete: the river, the wounds, the silence. This dog hadn't escaped for his own sake, he had escaped with something for someone. He hadn't just survived horror, he had defied it. Nolan stood up. "They're coming back," he stated. "I know it," the ranger nodded. "We'll be on standby. But if you see them again, don't wait." By the time Nolan returned to the cabin, dusk was settling over the snowbanks like a soft shadow. The shepherd was alert at the door before he even stepped inside. No barking, just stillness, awareness. Nolan looked at him and said nothing. Words were unnecessary. Later that night, Nolan sat near the fire. The collar still lay on the table. The puppy was resting against the shepherd's leg, nestled into a fold of the blanket. Nolan poured himself tea and stared into the flames, then turned to the shepherd. "I thought I brought you in," he said. "But maybe you brought me back." The shepherd raised his head, ears flicking toward a sound outside. Nolan froze, listening, the crunch of snow, a branch snapping with an unnatural rhythm, not the forest, not a deer, something else. And just like that, the cabin wasn't just home anymore, it was a barricade, a target. And they were all in it together. The cabin had never seemed more confined. Shadows danced on the snow outside, faint enough to make one doubt their reality. But the shepherd entertained no such doubts. His posture was rigid, his body taut, his eyes laser-focused on the window. Nolan moved unhurriedly, placing the shotgun within easy reach. The fire had been allowed to diminish to minimize visibility. The sole illumination emanated from the glow of dying embers, casting long, wavering shapes across the walls. Then they heard it, tires crunching on frozen gravel, followed by silence. The black truck had returned. Nolan rose slowly, his breathing quiet, his hand gripping the edge of the fireplace as if to steady the very world. The shepherd remained motionless at first, merely observing. Then he stood, distributing his weight evenly on all 4 legs. The limp was gone, not because he was healed, but because he had made a resolve. Nolan opened the trap door beneath the floorboards, an old storage access. Without a word, he lifted the puppy, still feeble but now blinking with awareness, and laid him gently in the dark space below. The shepherd turned to look once, just once, before returning his attention to the door. Nolan cracked it open. The shepherd bolted. It was not an act of rage nor of panic, it was precision. Movement like water, low, swift, practiced. Nolan had never witnessed an animal move with such quiet command. He followed behind, shotgun raised, his boots crunching just audibly enough. And then they saw them, 2 men. One paced near the tree lean, the other closer to the cabin's edge, flashlights off, hands occupied, one with a rope, the other with a pistol tucked against his coat. They weren't searching, they were waiting for Nolan to emerge or for the dog to return. But they were unprepared. The first man fell so rapidly he didn't even cry out, just a thud, a flurry of limbs, a shout muffled by snow. The shepherd was upon him, teeth sinking into his arm, then his back, pinning him without intent to kill, merely to control. The second man spun around too late. "Drop it." Nolan's voice sliced through the stillness like lightning. The man froze, then looked down. The shepherd stood between them, growling low, blood on his chest, not his own. The man's eyes darted to Nolan, then to the trees, as if assessing his chances of escape. "I wouldn't," Nolan said. "You won't make it 10 steps." It was not an empty threat. Minutes later, blue and red lights began to dance across the snow, silent yet thunderous in their significance. The ranger station had not delayed this time. They arrived in full force, 4 trucks, 2 officers on foot, and 1 K-9 unit whose handler knelt in silence as they handcuffed the men. From the coat pocket of the man still moaning in the snow, a bent metal tag was retrieved. It was smeared with dried blood, crudely etched with a word Nolan already knew by heart. Dog. No name, no history, just that single word. But it was more than enough. Inside the cabin, the fire roared back to life. The shepherd, bruised and panting, lay beside the crate again. The puppy squeaked softly, crawling up to Nestle against his chest. And for the first time, the shepherd let out a sound Nolan hadn't yet heard from him. A soft whine. Not of pain, not of fear, but of relief. Later, when one of the rangers asked what Nolan planned to do, he didn't hesitate. "They stay," he said. "Both of them." "You sure? That shepherd's a fighter. Could be hard to handle." Nolan just smiled. "He's not hard to handle. He just needed someone to stand beside him." The snow kept falling that night, blanketing the world in silence once more. But the silence inside the cabin wasn't hollow anymore. It was full of breath, full of life, full of something that had nearly been stolen but was now defiantly, beautifully alive.